Hello, everyone. I'm Jay Parsons, professor and farm and ranch management specialist with Nebraska Extension and the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Today, as part of our weekly webinar series, typically live every Thursday at noon, you can find a schedule of the upcoming webinars as well as an archive set of recordings of past webinars on our center's website. The URL is cap.unl.edu. That's cap.unl.edu. With forage availability at a premium, many producers are looking at annual forages planted on cropland as a potential valuable feed resource this year. Today, we will discuss tips for integrating annual forages into your cropping plans, including planting dates, seeding mix, expected forage production, and timing of forage availability. The annual forage plan of insurance represents an opportunity to obtain crop insurance to protect against the primary production risk of low precipitation. Several changes to the annual forage plan of insurance take effect this year. The current sign-up period for annual forage insurance ends on July 15th. We will discuss the changes that have been made and tips for how to integrate annual forage insurance coverage into your program. Joining me today to help present is Dr. Daren Redfearn, professor and extension forage and crop residue specialist here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Hi, Daren.
Morning, Jay, or I guess good afternoon now. Thanks for you guys for having me do another webinar with you this week.
We'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to let Daren go first with some of the production tips, and then I'll come back here in a little while and talk about the annual forage insurance plan. So Daren, the floor is yours.
All right, Jay, thanks very much. I know as Jay had talked a little bit about the annual forages, I think a lot of at least the specific focus that I'll have during my part of the presentation will be on the summer annual part of that. And as Jay said, we'll focus a little bit on some of the details with seeding rate, talk a little bit about some of the characteristics of these annual forages that are pretty specific to different varieties of the summer annuals, and then also talk a little bit about what some of our expectations are for the remainder of the summer. So with that, Jay, if I could have the next slide, please. Talking a little bit about the current pasture and forage outlook, and I know this is not a surprise to anyone, but just to reiterate things that most people already know, hay prices are still very high. Right now, they are slowly inching upwards. Alfalfa hay is upwards of $265 a ton. Grass hay is $230 a ton. For parts of Nebraska now, looking at these two figures I've got, and again, these just kind of point to the situation that we're dealing with. But precipitation is limited. Precipitation has been limited. Soil moisture status is pretty low across much of the state. Key point of that first figure there that points to the precipitation basically that we've received during the first 6 months of 2023 is at least in the eastern part of Nebraska, we're somewhere around 5 to 10 inches total. Normally, we would be probably about 50% more than that. I think I saw where we're probably 7 or 8 inches below normal currently for the year. Looking over at the drought monitor, that just reiterates the length of the dry conditions that we've had here in the eastern part of the state. Surprisingly, the western part of the state, while still in a drought, much of the severity of those droughts have been reduced. They've actually received quite a bit more moisture than we have here in the eastern part of the state. And, it's always find this kind of interesting because every time it seems like I put together a talk on how to manage a drought, we get a bit of a shower, and they're actually predicting, at least here in the eastern part of the state, pretty widespread precipitation for the upcoming week. And so thinking about some of the drought, it always seems like it rains about 15 or 20 minutes before it's too late. So we did receive a bit of a shower this morning. I do know there's some other areas that have received some precipitation. So hopefully we'll climb out of these overly dry conditions that we have, and that will allow some of these pasture and forage conditions to improve somewhat. Next slide, please, Jay. Looking at the forage calendar, and those of you that tuned in last month or a couple months ago when we were talking more about the small grains and the spring forages, probably saw this slide there. But now if you focus on that bottom part down on the warm season grasses, typically whether we're talking about our perennials or our annual grasses during the summer, typically what we're looking at is about 150 days of production. If you note on the calendar, part of that production can occur during May, but we really kick the production into gear most often beginning in June. However, that's not the case this year. So I'd like to point out that we're now starting July, which is a little bit past our normal time that we would be able to produce some forages. But the big thing that we have been missing has been precipitation. So effectively what we're looking at is that 150 days has now been whittled off to probably 90 to 100 days of production. So while we still have a fairly long window here, that has been reduced a little bit. Next slide, Jay. Talking about some of the annual forages, and I'll point out this NEB guide. A lot of what I'm talking about now is in the NEB guide titled Summer Annual Forage Grasses. That's G2183. I do have that on a slide toward the end, so you don't need to write that down just yet. But this particular NEB guide describes in much detail about some of the highlights that I'm going to present today. So just as a reminder, mostly these warm season summer annual species, different groups of them. You've got a group of the sorghums that include Sudan grass, sorghum Sudan grass, which is actually a hybrid of the Sudan grass, which has a lot more grassy characteristics, and the forage sorghum, which has a lot more characteristics of the grain sorghum. The difference between the grain sorghums and the forage sorghums, a lot of the forage sorghum species don't really have a lot of grain production to them, but they do have an awful lot of biomass production. So the sorghum Sudan grass hybrids, they take on some characteristics of both the Sudan grass and the forage sorghums. The pearl millet is one that's a summer annual. It's a different species. What's unique about it? It tends to be maybe a little less productive. Mostly, I think it has a little more leaf production in it than the sorghum Sudan grass. Would be pretty similar to the Sudan grass. Sudan grass has stems that are a little finer. It does have much better regrowth than either the sorghum Sudan grasses or the forage sorghum. Pearl millet also has a pretty good regrowth after harvest. The last two warm season grass species that I'll briefly mention are German foxtail millet, and it's quite a bit different than the pearl millet. Pearl millet has a pretty long growing season to it. It can have multiple harvests on it in a normal year. I still think now, if it were planted now, might get a pretty good harvest and an additional decent regrowth harvest on it in the fall if conditions improve. The difference between the German foxtail millet and the pearl millet is that German millet or foxtail millet, it's has a very short maturity. It's very quick from planting to harvest, so its production window is very much shorter. Because that growing season is so short, it puts a lot more of its effort in producing above ground biomass, so it doesn't have a real strong root system, but it does withstand and can be productive under some dry land conditions. Teff is one that has a lot of interest. It kind of has some good characteristics of many of these others. It's going to be similar to the German foxtail millet in that it does have a very short window of productivity. But different from the foxtail millet, after harvest, that teff can continue to regrow if some moisture is available. However, it does withstand drier conditions a little bit better than that group of forage sorghums and also the pearl millet. Typically, what we see some in a lot of these diverse cover crop mixtures, especially for our summer annual grazing, you'll see sunflower included in those quite regularly, either cowpea or mung bean or two others that you'll see. Then also sun hemp is probably one that's getting some increased inclusion in many of those cover crops. One of the big differences about those those sunflowers and those other legumes down there is those are typically a little higher seed cost than some of the other grasses. So typically when you see many of those other species included in a mixture, the cost of that mixture tends to go up. Nothing at all wrong with including those in there. It just does have a little bit higher seed cost associated with those diverse mixtures. So kind of in summary, and this is what we'll follow up with a bit here. These summer annual forages, especially if they've got available moisture and a little bit of added fertility to them, they can have some high forage yield potential, depending on how you manage them from a maturity standpoint. They can have a pretty high quality, but it can also moderate as they mature. And if you let it mature low enough, they can have some low quality. So there's a lot of flexibility in how we manage these summer annuals, produce a high forage yield with basically the quality of our choosing. And again, if we look a little bit at the forage management, there's a lot going on this slide. We'll talk a little bit about some of the yields. And these yield tables are taken right out of that NEB guide, so we won't spend a lot of time on there. But if you look at those sorghum species, the Sudan grass, the sorghum Sudan grass hybrids, and the forage sorghums, there's some overlapping yields there. Just point out that these are from irrigated forages that had a full season of growth on them. So the irrigation, they were grown at North Platte and they were irrigated. Effectively, that management there would mimic the moisture availability that we would have in the eastern part of the state. So the production would be pretty similar in a normal year. Since we've missed a month of growth already, I would probably reduce those production estimates by about 25% or so. But typically you see them pretty similar yields. That pearl millet does have can have a yield similar on the high end, but it can also be a little bit lower. If you look at the foxtail millet and teff, again, those have some lower yield potentials, mostly just due to the growth of maturity. We talked a little bit about the quality. If you look at the quality based on growth stages, you can have some very high TDN and protein from these summer annuals from plants that are in the vegetative stage. Even moving on into as they increase in maturity, TDN and protein for heading and bloom still can be quite adequate for meeting a lot of the nutritional requirements. We really don't see the feed value begin to really drop until you move to the dose stage or that point, and until the plants start to that seed begins to mature. Is when you start to see a lot of the decreased quality. So effectively, as long as you harvest those either by grazing or hay or even silage before they start producing a lot of hard seed, you can keep that quality maintained very, very well. So as we look at some of the differences we might manage these forages for either hay, silage, or grazing. A lot of these are my preferences. I'll start out with the hay. I think if you're looking at producing only hay, I think the Sudan grass and the sorghum Sudan grass probably would be the top choices. The Sudan grass, mostly because as we've mentioned, it's got some finer stems. It would tend to dry a bit quicker, and it can also have some decent yields. That sorghum Sudan grass would have a little thicker stem. Uh, the stem would on the sorghum Sudan grass probably would make up about half of the dry matter. The Sudan grass would be a little leafier than the sorghum Sudan grass. The sorghum Sudan grass would be a little bit tougher to get cured quickly compared to the Sudan grass. Kind of on a second tier there, I think you've got the pearl millet and the foxtail millet and the teff. The pearl millet of those three probably would be a little bit ahead of the foxtail millet and the teff, just primarily because of the yield potential and the regrowth. That foxtail millet, and I hate to, it's most often we look at that as an emergency forage crop because of its short production stage. Although I think it does have some value, in particular in dry land or limited moisture conditions, which I would say we have that even here in the eastern part of the state, because we really don't have a lot of stored soil moisture. So I do think foxtail millet has some opportunity for planting as a hay crop that would be, from planting to harvest would be somewhere between about 45 and 60 days. So it's very quick. As such, it doesn't have that great a yield. Teff, as I mentioned earlier, will do pretty well under some limited moisture conditions. If it's got adequate moisture, it does have the capability to do a pretty good job on some regrowth. If we're looking at only silage, forage sorghum or sorghum Sudan grass are probably our two best bets. I would say if we're stuck or not stuck, if we're only going to produce silage and not have that opportunity for hay or grazing, then I would go with forage sorghum, primarily because it's a single harvest. The thick stems on the forage sorghum just almost eliminate it from possibility of making any kind of high quality hay. Sorghum Sudan grass would make a pretty decent silage crop as well. When we get into grazing, here's separated this out into summer and fall. And I've talked a little bit about winter grazing, but I mean, effectively, all these species or varieties will work for the winter grazing piece of that. But I think if we're looking at grazing in the summer, and in particular as we're moving into the fall, I think pearl millet has a little bit of an advantage there, primarily because it doesn't have any potential to produce prussic acid. Sudan grass has a potential to produce prussic acid, although it's the lowest of those three sorghums that we've talked about. And so that's kind of critical as we're moving into that summer period where we might have a couple of mornings with some frost that warm up during the day. That sorghum Sudan grass, if we had that planted, we might see some issues there. So just to be on the safe side, I think the pearl millet or the Sudan grass, or a mixture of the pearl millet and Sudan grass would have an advantage for summer and fall grazing. Mentioned a little bit about the winter grazing, and we'll talk briefly about that, but I'll point you to a neb guide that'll help you manage some through the winter grazing piece on that. Next slide, Jay. So, the considerations, where we are here effectively, we're the 1st of July. On these summer annuals, we can plant them anytime before August 15th. If you recall back on that calendar I showed back a few slides ago, I didn't point this out. But that October time frame there, where we're kind of moving from that transition from the Indian summer, if you will, from the transition from the summer to the fall grazing, where we can have those hot days and cold nights and those potential. August 15th, October 1st, you've got 45 days of production potential there. So you can produce have the potential to produce probably a couple of tons per acre. would be my guess. But so I think that the key thing are those number one and those number 2 points. There's a situation where soil moisture is present. Some of the areas of the state have that, some of the areas don't. The reason I point that out is not to say that you can't plant when only soil moisture is present, but if soil moisture is present and you plant into a moist soil, basically you're going to need about 1 additional rainfall to get that plant germinated and up so that it can grow. If you're planting into a situation where soil moisture is not present, then you're going to need a couple of rains. You're going to need a precipitation event to germinate those seeds, and then you're going to need an additional precipitation event to get those plants productive. So I would think about those a little bit. Up until looking at the forecast, the precipitation was very irregular. I think as we're moving into the fall, we're increasing that the probability that planting into an area where soil moisture is not present. I don't think that's going to be quite as risky over the next couple of weeks. Looking briefly at seeding rates, and again, this is covered in that NEB guide. The Sudan grass and sorghum Sudan grass, along with the foxtail millet, are somewhere between 15 to 25 pounds of seed per acre. Sorghum, the forage sorghum, the pearl millet, about half of that, 6 to 12 pounds an acre. And then the teff has a pretty low seeding rate. Depending on whether or not the seed is coated or uncoated, that 4 to 6 pounds is for uncoated teff seed. If the teff seed is coated, you'll need to double up on those recommended seeding rates a bit there. So those are kind of the options and some of the considerations to think about a bit as we get into deciding whether we're going to plant or not. But August 15th is kind of the cutoff there. Oh, you're fine, Jay. So if you're deciding the hay piece is pretty straightforward. I think as we talk about grazing, in particular as we're moving into some of the late fall or winter grazing, using these summer annuals as a stockpile forage, we can have the potential to produce quite a bit of production basically between now and the first killing frost. So the question the question becomes, how do you capture that forage production? And I've got a little series of photographs here that wind row grazing NEB guide number is G1616, and I'll have this on the following slide. But if you look at that middle picture with the shovel handle there, that's one of those summer mixes that has been killed by frost. The photo right to the right of that shows the livestock grazing on that, and kind of some of the things you're looking at. While they're able to graze some of that forage, they're not grazing a whole lot either. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's being wasted, but it's certainly not being consumed by the livestock. If you look at that photo that's immediately under that screenshot of that windrow grazing NEB guide, you can see some of the forages, or see that summer annual that's been harvested and windrowed up. Now, I don't know whether or not this was eventually baled as hay or baleage or was windrow grazed, but effectively the early part of that management is the same. You're harvesting that, putting it into a windrow, and then you're restricting the grazing of that so that those animals are having a much better utilization of that forage, and you're able to stretch your forage using that management strategy. So again, there's a very good description in that NEB guide about that. So kind of the top tips for the day, summer annual forages, that's our current opportunity to meet some of these forage deficiencies that we're currently trying to manage around. From a fertilizer standpoint, because we're under dry conditions or even under uneven stands, I would fertilize after stand emergence, just to make sure that I know the fertilizer is going to be used for forage growth. And I mentioned the uneven stands there. You might choose to not fertilize that, or might choose to reduce the rate a bit if stands are uneven. There's also the strategy to manage the more productive acres a little more intensively. That's going to allow you better use of available soil moisture and also precipitation, as well as that nitrogen fertilization. And then as we talk about the application cost, again, that's going to spread that out over fewer acres. So for some of the additional information, these are the two NEB guides that I have talked about and used for the basis of this productions. NEB guide 2183, which is summer annual forage grasses, and also NEB guide 1616, which addresses some of the specifics to that wind row grazing. In addition to these two NEB guides, I'd also like to point out that Mary Dranowski and I have put together a Beef Watch article for the July Beef Watch. That'll be those of you that subscribe to Beef Watch. I get that email at 7 a.m. on the 1st of every month. So if you've subscribed to the Beef Watch newsletter, you'll get that on this Saturday. The title of that is Annual Forage Options for July and August Planting, which we actually had put this together during the last dry spell a few years ago. So we've recycled that one. But again, that's going to be in the July Beef Watch. For those of you that don't subscribe to that article, the website for that is beef.unl /beefwatch. And I think, Jay, that covers my info for today.
Yep, sure does. Thanks, Daren. That was good stuff. And we'll switch over now and talk a little bit about the annual forage insurance program, and then we'll open it up to questions. So as Daren mentioned, a lot of people are looking at annual forages to fill the forage gap, and there's some options there. And since it's all the reasoning to look for it is lack of moisture, lack of soil moisture in particular. So precipitation risk remains a major concern for folks. And there is an insurance product that does apply to annual forage. It's called the Annual Forage Insurance Program, AFIP, if you want to acronym to work with, but I just call it annual forage insurance myself. And there is quite a bit of an increase in use of it in the state of Nebraska, but it's still relatively unknown. And when I say that, that's compared to our other precipitation risk management program, which is the pasture rangeland forage insurance, or PRF. Which is on several millions of acres in the state. It's been around for a while, and people are familiar with that. Annual forage is similar to that, in that it's triggered off of a rainfall index. So it's going to use historical grid data, and these grids are technically 0.25 degrees longitude by 0.25 degrees latitude, which where we live here in Nebraska, in terms of where we sit on the globe, it's about 12 miles east to west, so in width, and about 16 miles north to south for the grids. And I'll show you an example of that here in a moment. But this data comes from NOAA, and they basically have data all the way back to 1948 for various grids throughout the state. That covers the whole state, and that forms the basis for the insurance in terms of what you are insuring, and then of course how you would get paid if we have a precipitation deficit. So just a quick example, a generic example of that. So your historical data will determine what 100% of normal is. And let's just say that you pick a coverage level that says you want to insure at 75% of normal rainfall. So that's the blue bar here, representing 3/4 of what is normal precipitation. If the precipitation over that interval period, which is 2 months intervals for these, falls below that. So in this example, it'd be at 44. You're essentially at a 31% deficit. So then the 0.31, right, is what basically is multiplied by your coverage, and that's your dollar value of coverage, and then that's what you get paid on that for that deficit. The premise behind it, of course, is that If you're short of precipitation, you're going to suffer some sort of production loss, and hopefully this compensates you for that. So annual forage insurance, like I said, it's similar to PRF. It is going to use that 2-month rainfall index intervals, just like PRF does. And you can insure up to 90% of normal precipitation for any 2-month interval that you can buy coverage for. But unlike PRF, which is for perennial forage systems, whether grazing or haying, this is for annual crops that are planted with the intent of it to be used for livestock feed. So it could be, you could intend to graze it, you could be intending to harvest it for hay or chop it for silage. The intent is that you're planting this annual crop to use it for feed. As I mentioned at the early on, that it has a July 15th sign up date in the intro to the webinar, so that's coming up fairly quickly if you're interested in it. It is one of those products that not a lot of people know about throughout the country because it's not available in very many states. Nebraska is one of the original states that it became available in it back in 2014 when it was introduced. And basically it goes north to south through the midsection of the country. So that both of the Dakotas and then going south from us, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas have had it available since the beginning. And then a few years after it was originally introduced, they added Colorado and New Mexico to the mix of the states where you can purchase it. So it's not available in our neighbors east or west. So Missouri and Iowa are not included in this, nor are Colorado and Wyoming if you're out on the border. But all of the counties in Nebraska do have this available for people to sign up for it and purchase. It is a mid-year to mid-year product. So that sign up deadline is July 15th this year. And at that point, you're picking coverage for anything that's planted between July 16th of this year and July 15th of next year. So you got to plan ahead with this product, and that's one of the tricky parts about using it. I mentioned they made some changes to the program, and this is the big one. If you signed up for this last year or one of the preceding years, you're probably familiar with it having quarterly growing seasons. So you purchased precipitation insurance based off of which quarter you planted your annual forage in. They've changed that to where it's a monthly growing season. So there's 12 growing seasons with this product now, all triggered by which month you actually plant in. Daren mentioned August. So the sign up deadline right now is July 15th. So the first planting month that you can actually insure is for something planted in August of this year. If you planted it in August, the choices for insurance are essentially the next 6 2-month intervals, which actually cover 7 months because it's going over 2 months. So let's say you planted in August, the first 2-month interval you can insure would be September, October. If you chose to put insurance there, then you would not be able to insure October, November, because you can't double insure the same month. So if you insured September, October, then the next 2-month interval will be November, December. But you could stretch the coverage all the way out into where you were covering March, in the February, March interval of next spring. And a lot of people ask me, why would you want to insure something that far out? I'm planning it in August. I'm planning to use it this fall, especially if you're in a dry land situation and you're dealing with soil moisture deficits and a little bit worried about that. Essentially putting the coverage out here in this February, March, you're looking at soil moisture conditions being met for the following crop. So keep that in mind, especially in a dry land situation where you're planning to follow this with a crop next year and you want to make sure that you have enough soil moisture for that next crop too. Keep that in mind as you decide which months to insure. But essentially, you would pick the months that you expect to plant, and then you would select the insurance coverage that you'd want to have for those following 6 possible intervals that you could cover, keeping in mind that you can't overlap the same month twice. So a lot of people will say, hey, what do I do if I don't know if I'm going to plant in August or September? Well, the solution to that is to sign up for both. And the thing is that you have to get signed up. And then it's up to you to report the actual acres that you plant. So if you're not sure which months you're going to plant in, sign up for both and then report the acres in the month that you do plant. So this is kind of a summary of it, going through things, the details of it. The coverage year again starts July 16th and runs through July 15th. There's 12 growing seasons, all based off of the planting month. So its earliest one would be August, and you would be, at this point, you'd be signing up for anything you plan to plant from August 1 of this year through the end of July next summer. That you possibly would want coverage on. The rainfall insurance, of course, is those 2-month intervals. There'll be 6 of them following that planting month, so 7 total months that you can spread coverage out over. The information that you're required to submit by this closing date are these 3 things. Okay, you would say, I want coverage of so much rainfall, right? And the coverage levels are 70% to 90% in 5% increments. So 70, 75, 80, 85, 90. You'd say, how much rainfall do I want insurance coverage on? Productivity factor, adjust the county-based value per acre. You can put more dollars on, up to 1.5 times the county-based value and dollar value per acre if you want more insurance, or you can reduce it down as low as 60%. I generally don't recommend people reduce the coverage by the percentage of coverage. If you want to put less dollars into the insurance, just insure fewer acres is probably the easiest way to do that. Or if you want to actually get a real break on your coverage, then increase your deductible on your rainfall, because that actually affect your insurance premium rate too. So I'll show you an example of this here in the next couple of slides. And then the other thing is say, okay, so I want coverage for these growing seasons. I want rainfall across these intervals, and I want to spread this insurance value across those intervals in these percentages. So you can put up to 40% in any 2-month interval as you go across, and you would spread that across that growing season. So again, you would put those in place. You would sign up for anything you think you might want coverage in. And then the coverage actually kicks in when you report the acres. So if you decided to plant, say, August 20th, you would have until September 5th, the 5th day of the following month, to go in and report that acreage to your insurance agent to then take the coverage that you selected and put it in place on those acres. What happens if you don't report the acres? Then you don't have the coverage. Okay, there's no penalty for not reporting that acres. It's basically a matter of, you would decide that you will want to get the coverage in place. You need to report the acres that you want the coverage on, but you need to sign up for all the coverage that you think you might want by July 15th. So the recommendation is put it across everything you think you might plant, and then go in and report the acres when it actually happens. Okay, so people learn better by example. So I'll just show you a quick example of that. This is for a grid down by Beatrice. We're just slightly north of Beatrice. Beatrice is a nice town to look at because depending on which part of Beatrice you're in or which direction you go out of town, you could be in one of 4 different grids. So these are 4 different grids, each of them about 16 miles north to south and about 12 miles east to west. So I happened to select this grid out here to the northwest. Actually, that's northwest of town. That's a misprint. But anyway, we're out here in grid 24433. And we're in Gage County, so that's going to determine dollar value per acre. And then this grid is going to determine a rainfall data that the insurance is based off of. So this is our growing season 1. I just happened to select August because that's our next month that we can get coverage in. I would need to tell the insurance person by July 15th what level of rainfall I want. I selected 90% here. What productivity factor I want to choose. I selected 100%, mainly to show you that the base value per acre for Gage County on Annual Forages is almost $380 an acre. So that's the one that you can adjust up to 150% of that value or down as low as 60% of that value. I just put it as 100% of that. Now, because I'm doing 90% of coverage, that means my actual protection is at $341.58. All of this is subsidized between 51 and 59%. If I insure at 90% rainfall, it's a 51% subsidy. If I insure at 80 or 85, it's a 55% subsidy. And if I insure at 70 or 75, it's a 59% subsidy. So subsidy goes up as your coverage level goes down. With August planting, I can insure starting in September, October. So I went ahead and put 40% of the protection there, which is $136.63 per acre. The premium rate they're going to charge me for that based off of historical rainfall and expectations they got to pay out is about 16.5%. So that makes the total premium $22.67. When the government pays 51%, that means I am paying $11.11 for that coverage. I insured September, October. I went ahead and put another 20% of coverage in November, December. So that works out with $68 of protection. My premium on that is $874. I went ahead and skipped January and put the next interval as February, March, because that stretches me all the way out. I went ahead and put another 40% there, so $136 again per acre in protection. And that premium is 14.95. You'll notice on these two, November, December, the premium's quite a bit higher than it is for September, October. Again, that's based off of their expectations that they have to pay out an indemnity. And we typically find winter months are more expensive to insure because we get less inches of actual precipitation there, even though we might get quite a few inches of snowfall. So it doesn't take much of a deficit to be percentage-wise quite a bit below normal. So I'll show you a quick one. We won't be able to go through the entire example, but I'll show you one that ensures more of the growing season. Now, how did this work out last year? These are described as 2023 results because, again, this goes mid-year to mid-year. So the September, October is actually September, October of 2022, which for this product is in the 2023 growing season. So this stuff, most of these columns here, except for the last two columns, are what I showed you on the previous slide. So my total producer premium here, if I add it up, is about $34.80 an acre. The actual index values for September, October of 2022 was about 42% of normal. November, December was 69.7. February, March was 56.8. So all three of these intervals that I bought insurance are well below the 90% mark of normal. So it's going to take those differences times the total dollar value that I had, which was based off of that total value, 100% of productivity value for the Gage County. And that's going to get multiplied out times that amount, that 40% of that I had in September, October amounts to a $73 indemnity. November, December, I put less dollar values there, right? So it's down to 15.41. It also had the highest index, even though it paid off. And February, March was another $50. So if I bought this insurance last year, that $35-ish premium per acre would have netted about $139 in indemnity. So well over $100 to the good. Now, of course, that was an extremely dry year. You want to look at it historically over time. So there's the results from last year. But if you go back the past 20 years, you'll see quite a few large numbers in here. 2006, it was up over $140, for example, but you also see 2011, $132 for this exact same coverage. You'll see a few zeros creep in here, right? There's a zero in 2019 and 2010 and 2004. Those do creep in. But overall, that $34 premium or $35 premium, more or less, produced an average indemnity of $64.50 or about a 85% return per dollar invested. And over that 20 years, 15 of the 20 years, the indemnity was bigger than the premium. So we typically see this because the government is picking up a large part of those premiums for you with that subsidy kicking in. So just to show you a quick adjustment, if you went to March planting, so this would be growing season 8 on the calendar, it's the same grid, same location. So all the numbers are the same, except for we're just ensuring different periods here. And I spread it out 35, 35, 30. That is not that big of a deal to discuss here, but I wanted to show you this just because you see these premium rates are anywhere from that 13.85% up to 15.78%, because these months are typically where we get quite a bit more moisture. So they're a little bit cheaper to insure because it takes a much bigger deficit percentage wise, right, to for the insurance actually have to pay out an indemnity. So that almost $35 premium that we had before covering some of those winter months with the August planted forage, on this one for March planting, covering largely spring and summer months, it only costs $24.32 to insure, but the results are pretty similar. We end up in 2022 results. So this would be April, May of 2022 through August, September. Things were plenty wet in the early part where we didn't get any indemnity. But when we hit August, September last year, super dry, only about a quarter of normal, $74, which of course kicked in and more than paid off our premium that we would have owed. So this is how that one worked out. Lots of similar numbers. You see the numbers popping through. Instead of 1.85, 1.87, indemnity usually covers the premium. So just a couple of nuances, because we are getting a lot of questions on these, especially with some of the changes. This one involves more of the discussion of the changes. And that is if you're planning to follow with another annual forage or another annual forage in particular, you can insure the same acre twice. You just can't overlap the coverage, so to speak. So keep that in mind. You definitely want to work directly with, you'll have to work with your crop insurance agent to make sure you don't violate this, but they'll help you figure out what you can and can't insure. So the example here would be that if you planted in August for growing season 1 that I just showed you, that last interval I could insure is February, March. So I'm not eligible to get this insurance coverage on that same planted acre again until February planting, and the March, April is the first index I can insure. So your insurance agent will help you with that. But if you're going to double up on annual forages, keep that in mind. You can insure the same acre twice, relatively speaking, but you got to make sure that it's not overlapping in terms of how that planting season and coverage level works. The other question we're getting a lot on right now is people have failed spring or summer crop. They planted something, it's not growing. They're thinking of doing something different. In general, you can't collect a full indemnity on 2 different crops in the same year on the same acre, kind of stuff like I mentioned earlier with the overlaps, the precipitation being the exception as long as you don't overlap. But in this case, if the earliest we can plant here is August 1, and that's the 2024 crop year for annual forage. So if you had something that's in the 2020 insured as a 2023 crop and you collected insurance on it, you got it all closed out. Again, work closely with your insurance agent, but there's a good chance that you can come in and insure an annual forage planted after August 1 using the rainfall index. So last couple of slides here, just how it's being used. I mentioned quite a bit of increase in the use. Certainly dry weather brings this to mind. We also, annual forages are picking up steam in terms of people utilizing them for forage. So kind of a combination of things going. But since its inception in 2014, you see the last couple of years has been the most use of it. And last year, by far, we had more policies sold than ever before. Most of them have been indemnified. There's still quite a few months left to be determined. I think this went through maybe February or March of this year. So good chance that even more people have picked up indemnities. We see the ratio it's been paying off the last few years. There was a spell in here from 2016 to 2019 where just as people insured, it paid out less than people paid in. But for the most part, because of the subsidy, and it's based off of historical data, long run, it should pay out more than it actually pays in. But we were seeing about a 2-to-1 on average payout over time. And right now this last year, we had about 38,000 acres insured. So that's how it's been used in the state. Coverage level. Most people insure at the 90% level. And this is just for last year's 2022 crop year. But we do have some people pick up at the lower level. They get a higher subsidy for that, take out a little bit more of a deductible. The thing I'll point out here is that the loss ratios tend not to be worse if you go lower on this. It's just that you're investing less dollars. You have to accept a bigger deductible. But when it's super dry, and this coverage does kick in and pay back very similar on a long run basis in terms of what the producer sees coming back for the dollar invested. Okay, so last thing I'll mention is our website, cap.unl.edu. We do have a forage page up there with a lot of information on annual forages. We also have a value of standing forage tool up there, which is an Excel spreadsheet that Daren and Mary Drunowski helped with, and we all put that together because some people have the forage standing in the field and want to sell it straight out. They don't have the livestock or they don't have the haying equipment. They're a crop producer. That's up there to help you figure out what that forage is worth standing in the field. So it's available for you to download and use. If you have any feedback or questions on it, my contact information is on there and you can feel free to get a hold of me. So that's what I had. And I think at this point, we would like to bring Daren back and entertain any questions folks have. Let me take a look here. What we have. Okay. Anybody has questions, you can type them into the chat or the question box. We can address them. Oh, we do have somebody who wants to study ag econ. So my contact information is on the website. If you go to that cap.unl.edu website, both Daren and I actually are on there. So if you look on there under personnel, you'll see us both listed with our contact information. We welcome you giving us any questions. That's how we learn, right? What the real relevant problems are. So we do have a question on using drought stress corn for forage. Do you have any thoughts on using drought stress corn for forage, insurance, and production implications? So Daren, I'll let you address the insurance side first.
Yeah, John, that typically is an every year issue somewhere in Nebraska. The big concern with that, using it as a forage, not considering the insurance piece to that, but the big concern with that is because of the nitrogen fertility levels on most cornfields. Most of that drought stress corn is pretty high in nitrates or can be pretty high in nitrates, and kind of depending on the size of it sometimes dictates a bit of the end use of it, if you will. I know if there's enough volume there that you can ensile that, making silage out of that drought stress corn will reduce the nitrates, typically around upwards of 40% or so. So there is some possibility for reducing that. The other piece to that, it would be grazing it, and there's quite a bit of concern just because of the nitrates with that. Most of the nitrates though are restricted down to the lower part of the stem in the corn plant. So basically, as long as you're not making the critters consume everything through grazing, as long as they're only removing the leaves, there's typically not an issue. I think probably a bigger problem there is, and a lot of that's bale for dry hay. Baling for hay doesn't reduce those nitrates. So the option you've got there is if you know it's got high nitrates, you can work with some of our beef nutritionists, and they can mix that high nitrate drought stress hay typically with some other feed stuff that doesn't have nitrate and manage it that way. There's a good bit of information scattered around. I did note that Jenny Reese is publishing an article in Crop Watch that will be out on Friday, is going to talk a bit about options for managing drought stressed corn.
Yeah, and on the insurance side, as usual, you got to work very closely with your agent on that. Let them know what you're thinking and intending to do. They would have a crop adjuster come out and take a look at it, and you just need to make sure all of that stuff takes place before you actually do anything to the crop itself, right? Whether you're destroying it or using it as forage. Just get all those things taken care of, and they can walk you through that on the timing. Yeah, they'd have to take care of that as it goes through. So if anybody would like to ask a question verbally instead of typing it in, you're welcome to do that too. Just let me know and I can unmute you. I think you can raise your hand on here, if I remember correctly. So Daren, are you seeing, I do have one question for you in terms of the actual crops themselves. You know, you were talking in general, the different types of crops.
Yep.
What kind of research is being done on these annual forages, and is there progress being made on anything in particular is my question.
So the annual forages, most of that work is used to be housed in a lot of the universities. Now a lot of that management or the development of the varieties is all by private industry. It didn't talk much about the sorghums, but some of those sorghums, especially those sorghum Sudan grass hybrids, they got all kind of different traits in those. They've got brown midrib, which basically increases the digestibility of those by some modifications and reduction in the lignin. There's a dwarf brachytic gene that they include in those sorghum Sudan grasses that basically shortens the internodes so that you've got less stem and the plant is more leafy, if you will, so they can increase the feed value that way. I feel almost pretty sure, although I don't know that I ever know if they've included a combination of that dwarf brachytic gene along with that brown midrib piece to that to see what the influence of that is. There's using my old southern words, there's a ton of different varieties for those sorghum Sudan grasses. Most of them are pretty good forage species. Some of them have more of the traits of the forage sorghum, so they're more stemmy. Some of them take on the traits of the Sudan grass, so they tend to be a little more leafy and finer stem. Some of them have high sugar concentrations, which is valuable if you're looking at making silage on it. But I think the big thing, the Sudan grasses, there's far fewer choices for the Sudan grass. Piper Sudan grass is probably the one that's probably the most readily available, and its claim to fame is it was selected for reduced prussic acid potential.
Yeah, thank you for going through that. I know, when we plant crops so many times in ag, we think of commodities, like everything's the same, and in forages, it's certainly not. And when you think about the feed value and how they'd actually interact with the animal and grazing or feeding, it's can get pretty complex. And when advances are made, we don't always hear about them right away. So that's good information. So another question. Is there research on climate smart adoption on the forage? I don't know if you want to address that or not. I know got a lot of climate smart dollars floating around.
Yeah, there's a lot of climate smart dollars around. Actually, the forages tend to always be on the tail end of a lot of the funding. Much of that work is done, at least with the forages. At least right now, we've got Jay and I are on a project. It's a bioenergy grass project. And while it's not directly, I would call it a climate smart project, there are some climate smart pieces to that, including greenhouse gas reduction and water use. The animal science group, they're doing some, I would say that their climate smart agriculture is a lot the same way it's done under the umbrellas of some other work, but they're looking at some of the greenhouse gas production from livestock. So, while it's hard to point to something exactly that way, there are some efforts going on, at least at Nebraska, that we haven't got a lot of data or a lot of years of data, so I don't know that we're able right now to talk about anything specifically that would have an advantage or be adoptable from a climate smart standpoint.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is climate smart's kind of trying to, realistically, it encompasses a lot of things. As you alluded to there, with greenhouse gas emissions, carbon sequestration, water stuff, fertilizer use. There's a lot of things that are looked at a lot of different levels, and forages certainly figure in there in different ways, depending on what you're actually managing toward. But a lot of times forages come up in that equation in terms of part of the crop rotation and part of those considerations. So good question. Certainly a lot of work and a lot of interest in it. Well, we've reached the top of the hour, so I think we'll go ahead and close down. Thanks, Daren, for your presentation on all the production stuff that I constantly have my head spinning when you talk about it.
No, I very much enjoyed that and very much enjoyed talking about it.
Yeah, well, thank everybody for joining us. Just a reminder that this is recorded, like all of our webinars, and they'll be posted on our website at cap.unl.edu. That's also where you can go to see a listing of our upcoming webinars and register for those. We'd appreciate any feedback that you have as you exit today's webinar. You should have a brief evaluation that'll pop up, very short questions on there. It's really helpful for us to see not only just how you thought today's webinar went or what kind of impact it might have on you, but also to inform us of any future webinars, topics, and speakers. Feel free to drop us a note there and let us know, because we definitely want these to be useful for you and have a positive impact on your production situation or whatever you might be dealing with there. So thanks again to everybody for joining us. We'll go ahead and sign off, and everybody have a great rest of your day.
Yep, have a great week.